Thank you very much for coming. So my name is Peter Robertson, I'm the Dean of the Business School. And I'd like to welcome Diane Smith-Gander, AO, the Chair of our board, Glen Travers and John Van Der Wielen, and welcome distinguished guests. This evening's roundtable, it is a roundtable even though we're not in the round, and this of course is for COVID reasons, so my apologies for that, but I think we'll be able to have a good discussion. It's quite a nice lecture hall for this kind of discussion. So I'd like to acknowledge first that we're situated on Noongar land and that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their language, beliefs and knowledge. Now tonight's event is made possible by Glen Travers' unplanned longer than anticipated stay in Perth due to COVID. Glen is co-founder of the company Diabetology Limited and Proxima Concepts. And Glen was the recipient of the European Healthcare Entrepreneur of the Year in 1996, and his company was co-royalty holder with the 2005 Nobel laureates Marshall and Warren. Glen is also serving the university as a member of the Business School's Ambassadorial Council in the UK. And it's also my pleasure to welcome John Van Der Wielen, Chief Executive Officer of HBF Health. John's been CEO at HBF since 2017, and prior to that he served a number of capacities, some of them CEO of Friends of Life UK, CEO of Clerical Medical and Halifax Life in the UK, and he's a director of the Royal Flying Doctor Service in WA. And John holds an MBA from UWA and is a member of the UWA Business School Advisory Board. Glen and John are both experts in distinctive areas of health, and I think will bring unique insights into how we make the health sector better and more affordable. In particular, I guess one of the themes tonight is what are the bottlenecks to getting new health interventions to market and how we can manage the rising costs of healthcare. The COVID crisis puts into light the interconnectedness of health with social and economic outcomes, as well as the need for university and public research to work together with business to make these solutions happen. I'm going to ask Glen and John to speak for around 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up for discussion, comments and questions. And I'll be just moderating that, revert back to John and Glen to answer your questions or join in the discussion. So it is a discussion I encourage you to engage. Because there are lots of experts in here. The whole point is to draw on the collective expertise in the room. At the conclusion, I'll ask my colleague, Professor Shamit Sagar from the UWA Public Policy Institute to summarise the discussion. Where's Shamit? Shamit, thank you. The event will conclude with refreshments, also in the foyer, and I hope the discussion will continue then. So without further ado, thank you very much, and I'm going to turn over to Glen. Thank you.
So thank you for the invitation, Peter. Very challenging concept to try and do this in the space of 10 minutes. Just the first thing to say is that we've just lived through one of the most unprecedented few months I think any of us could imagine. The phenomenal change in activity around healthcare has absolutely changed the perception of what is possible. And I won't go into the broadest elements of this too much because I think John's going to cover quite a bit of it. But the point is that I think we have to just realise what's happened to us. In the space of 12 weeks to 14 weeks, things have happened that could never have been thought possible, particularly in adoption of new technologies. And this graph from McKinsey, I think there's a McKinsey representative here, is a classic example of it. The Singularity University, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, quite a controversial university, not considered to be great, but it was established on the basis that we were going to solve the aspects of the future. The whole university is dedicated to that. It's not about getting like I got a commerce degree, or it's not that approach. And this is really powerful because they've actually itemized some of the things. And when I looked through this list, I thought, you know, that is amazing. Even reimbursement coverage, I think John was just mentioning it to me before we came in here, when we're standing here. Hospital capacity in the UK when I was in London, No one said they could get together that many ICU beds in that time. They rented the biggest, an acre or more of space in London and had it ready, up and running within the space of 14 days. And I remember we were all going about Wuhan. Remember how amazing it was to see what they did in that time. So the responses at the policy level, the reimbursement level, the testing level, capacity, health workers even changing their behaviours. I think we all know that that shows what's possible. And then there was also the request of other companies in the UK. I remember Dyson, the vacuum cleaner company, was volunteering to help with some of the breathing equipment that was required. And you just actually had to wonder, is that really something that we could embrace? But actually, I don't know if they ever got to the end of their challenge, but there were certainly companies that, like Ford, I think, that did produce usable ventilators and so on. So I wanted to talk about the future opportunity rather than go too much into the bottlenecks. I've got 2 whole slides, 30 points of bottlenecks, if you like. But actually, you know, this concept of going from sick care to creating health and well-being, I know many of you are quite familiar with, which I was disappointed with, actually, because it stole a lot of the thunder of what I was going to talk about. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by the Sustainable Health Review that's been done by the WA government here. I think the guy that started it, or lady, was Crook, I think was her name. So it started out from there and it built into this wonderful document. And I have to say, it is one of the most progressive documents I've seen anywhere. And I've got a friend who works at a place called HIMSS, which is one of the world leading advisors to governments in this kind of general look at where to go with the future, adoption of new technologies, etc. And he sent me an interview that was done here in WA, actually, just a few months ago. And basically they were saying how advanced you were in Western Australia. So I'm not going to be teaching you anything about this, but I think the important thing to remember is that for every dollar spent on healthcare, you can get a $2 to $4 improvement in economic activity. And this is the argument we can use with government to get them to pay attention to particularly the areas that I'm interested in, which is research and development of new product and concepts. And the other aspect, which you know well, is this is about being patient-centric. You know, the concept of we are the clinician, we are going to impose on our patients, this is all going to change, whether you like it or not, any of you who are clinicians. It is absolutely under a challenge that's never been seen before, because people are starting to find that it's so valuable to be able to use telehealth to get to their medic, but then also between a GP and a specialist, they can talk directly. So there's, and I know the barriers to that were basically reimbursement and other things, but just the practicalities of that are sort of here to stay. And as I saw some data recently, every consultation by a patient saves 2 hours. And as I was saying to John, just when we were standing at the foyer trying to work out where we're supposed to be, it was 2 hours meant when you think about your organization. So I'm in an organization, voluntary organization of 26,000 CEOs, and I know how much time is wasted on the phone to various utilities and other things, but certainly sick leave is a big factor. And if you can take 2 hours out of their visit to the GP or to any practitioner, the huge saving that that will have to the economy. So all these things are valuable to be able to tell those that have to allocate the funds that are so critically needed to make this work. One of the recent examples in the UK is an app called GoodSam. And this was designed to not only make the patient-centric, but also to make the public-centric. And basically the public are volunteering if they do their health training, that they are prepared to move immediately to find somebody within their vicinity. It comes up on their app and it will tell you that there's somebody who is in peril, either fire, it can be police, it can be emergency. And they've had a number of bad examples, I have to say, where people have been sent 200 miles away, which is the wrong thing. They're supposed to be local. But all these things have teething problems. But basically, you know, we're seeing engagement, and it's amazing the number of volunteers. I mean, in the UK, when they wanted volunteers for the NHS to help out there, they got hundreds of thousands of people putting their hands up to help, including a lot of medics who retired to come back and just altered the workforce completely. It was just phenomenal to see the way it wasn't really a wartime mentality, but it was how can we help mentality. And this photograph just struck me when I was looking through the monumental changes in laboratories. And it's not just the fact that this doesn't get bored and doesn't get tired. The new technologies that you should look out for are touch technologies, where the touch that these, through some of the programming techniques now and the robotics are really making an impact on being able to lift very delicate things, place them in the right positions. And this is having a big effect on the breadth of what you can do in laboratories and other areas. But if I was going to design my life sciences approach, I would be starting with some kind of review like this, that actually told me what was going to be improved over the next 10 to 20 years and where there were going to be continuing gaps. And if you look at this, it's amazing, coincides with the Sustainable Health Review, that mental health disorders will remain basically without any help. It's 14% improvement out to 2040 by this expectation. And four of the areas that I mentioned there as some of the best improvements will be in infectious diseases. And you may or may not know, but I'm involved in developing oral vaccines and nasal vaccines for COVID, and also a rapid point of care test. And part of that is because our family looked at where are the areas in the world that we felt there were going to be the biggest issues, and actually that the big players weren't paying attention to. So we worked with DSTL, the US Porton Down, on MERS, and we developed an oral vaccine for MERS, and they said, oh, don't worry about it, it's fixed, you know, it's gone away, so we're not going to do anymore. And that was 3 years ago. Imagine if we'd taken the next step and gone into man and learned from that. You know, even 1 month's savings in this chaos that we've been through would make such a fantastic difference to the number of lives that could have been saved. And then I thought, just, I'm sorry, Peter, if I take another 2 minutes. Life science, I just thought I've got to use the opportunity to tell you what I think a life science model for an emerging resource-based economy should be. And this is really about all I've learned over the years as being a sort of financier, but also an operator, a technologist, working with regulators, etc., and internationally. And it's these points to me are critical for us or you in Western Australia. Coordinated cooperation with the state and federal government with a plan as to what technologies, and I'm using examples like I learned in China and in Israel. What technologies do you feel you need to be at the forefront in? Someone somewhere who knows has to come up with at least an array of opportunities. And then the second thing was talent, where I saw the Chinese sending their young people off to Stanford and Harvard, Oxford and Cambridge, and then absolutely waiting for them to become PhDs, pulling them back out of there and giving them the latest equipment, putting them into a room and saying, we want you to work on this. So they were very driven in their, and now we're now 5 to 10 years on from that, they are right at the forefront. And have a look at the number of patents being lodged by the Chinese. It's more now than anybody else, and they're the least patent observant country in the world. But they're using the system to make it very difficult for us, so we have to move. And so when I talk about talent, I mean recruiting talent of the highest order. Because what I've seen around most of the places where I see people working like Harvard and so on, I ran these courses, and it would usually come down to 1 or 2 people who had this capacity to see how this technology could work. Most other people, they're right at the forefront. Most other people are out here. So they're the ones that you need to get to. And we've seen it here with Barry Marshall, you know, the persistence, and even Steve Wilton, who might be here. You know, they've sort of pushed and pushed and pushed against the odds. And I think, but there are people out there getting no support in other parts of the world. And if you've got a search and development concept, if you know what you're starting out looking for, and you then go and try and find it, it's amazing what you can find out there. And that's really what I've been doing. So diabetes was the other area. And so we've been working on oral insulin for 20 years. And we're now in a phase 2B with an Indian partner. and hopefully we can take that through to market. Achievable targets, of course, the thing is you've got to have comparative advantage. And I think, there's so many great skills in Western Australia, but the comparative advantage is where are you really capable? So apart from research and development, there's also what are the skill bases that are here? So it might take you into a particular area such as mental health. And in particular in mental health, there are some tragic results in anorexia. So my daughter who came out here to study did a doctorate. She's doing research at the moment with an amazing woman in Holland who has just developed a technique over her last 20 years as to how to deal with this. And that she's just got amazing results of bringing these young ones back to life that's never been seen before. And that's being published in the next few weeks. So I think you just look at where is your community needing benefits? Where have you got the comparative advantage? And then laser focusing on it, attracting the best in the world. And then the regulatory barriers are unnecessarily there in some countries. One of the great things you have here, which is a real advantage, is you can do first-in-man human studies without full GMP manufacture. Now, some of the countries like America and others will say, oh my God, that's terrible. Actually, it's fantastic because you can safely do that. You do GMP-like manufacture in laboratories that are controlled, and it has to be with safe substances. But that is why a lot of big pharma are using here for the first studies, and you'll see them using it for COVID. So these are comparative advantages that still exist, and in regulation you can find tremendous opportunities in the future. Rapid adopters is fairly straightforward. Facilitating the structures, I don't know if you saw how fast Oxford moved from having their research go into a vaccine manufacture in reasonable quantities. And that was because some years ago, this point was raised up there, that they needed a facility to manufacture biologicals. And they felt that if ever there was something going to happen of the Oxford research, that was an opportunity they wanted to pursue. And obviously, a point-of-care diagnostic platform, there's all sorts of platforms that are for the future that could be done here relatively low cost, and others aren't doing it. Because you have to have the ability to say, we're going to invest. And we have to recognize that not everything has to be profitable. I looked at the Australian Future Fund. What a fund. $100 billion. How fantastic that is. But it requires a rate of return on investment. Now, I was a venture capitalist, and I'd say, actually, let me lose money, please. Because if you lose money, it means you're investing in R&D, because it's an expense, and R&D can produce medium-term to long-term outcomes. So I think you've got to have the right mentality to compete. Look at Amazon. How long did that company go with losses before it actually produced a profit? And it became one of the most powerful forces on the planet. So, we have to challenge these paradigms, and I think it's an important aspect of making a small country and a strong economy, but small country competitive. And the tax incentives for private investors, etc. Sorry, it's very important. And a bit controversial for my patent attorney friends, free access to pre-screened patent drafting, so that you can actually get your patents lodged to protect your work before you have to go sell it. You have to go out there and tell people how you're presenting, what you're doing. And unfortunately, sometimes that information slips out and you lose your protection once you've published it. So it's very important. And also to know whether you're in an area that is protectable. So there's a thing called freedom to operate, which is the second level, the due diligence that's done on any new project. That's a very important aspect too. Look, I could go on for ages. I think I should stop. And if you want to ask me barriers and all other things, I've got plenty on that as well. Thank you.
Actually, Glenn, I wish you'd carried on, because now I realise the pressure's on me and I don't know what I'm talking about. But I would say Glenn and I have got a lot in common, because neither of us knew what either was going to say. And look, I want to start with always declaring, when I get involved in the health sector and get asked to speak about things, is that I'm not a clinician. I'm a finance and strategy and investment person who's landed in the health sector, which hopefully what I do is really talk a lot about the insight to who pays, because regardless of what happens in our society with health, it's the fundamental around the economics and who pays which drives the outcomes. And that's not being the capitalist end of who pays. It's actually the realist part of who pays. And nothing more evident for me than taking on the role at HBF was, when we talk about the Australian health system, it's quite interesting because I talk about the whole health system. And I say the whole because we're one of the few countries that consistently segments ourselves into, do you mean private or public health? And I'm trying to come at it with a lens as the CEO of HBF. Do you mean someone who is a human, who is injured or ill or who needs help? And yet I find the medical fraternity just as frustrating with that, because I always put it into the public bucket or the private bucket, and I'm trying to look at the human bucket. And it's really important because the 50%, it's approximately 50% of Australians have private health insurance and 50% rely only on the public system. And that segmentation has delivered a brilliant outcome in Australia economically, because it actually has resulted in a global leading health system, whether you measure that via mortality or you measure it via health outcomes, or you measure it via longevity in the community. So our 50% mix has worked really well. And one of the important parts of that, I am a capitalist with a social conscience, in that the theory of the public and private health system in Australia, when you date back to the origins, was that those who have good employment, those who've had good income, should invest in their own health, and that frees up the public system to therefore look after those who may be less privileged and can have better quality access to the public system. That does seem to be morphing in a vastly different way today. And I think also very uniquely, when I look at someone like an HBF that's 80 years, it used to have 80% market share, and we have medical records for 57% of Western Australians with over 50 years of data, and we probably have better data in our systems than the health department. And we're starting to really, tuck into that. And I want to please make sure, my next comments are not misconceived, but I'm the numbers person, runs the numbers, has a look at how we can make health insurance more affordable. And every time I hear of a new health innovation, an exciting new robot, a way to keep people alive longer, in a private room, the actuary and I sit down and go, oh God, no, it's more interventions, more cost, and can't they die a little bit earlier? And there is actually a conflict of interest. What happens is all these health innovations are making people live longer. And we've got some fantastic data on knowing that, heart disease used to be one intervention and then you die. Now there's 5 interventions on your heart. Great, it's fantastic. You get another 5 chronic diseases and you stay along for so much longer that health insurance is becoming so much less affordable. But that's on both the public system and the private system. And one of the things I struggle with economically is I've actually got into the detail around costings. And I think it's something we need to sort out as Australians, is that if a public patient goes in for a prosthesis, the price is X dollars. If a private patient goes in for a prosthesis, it's around double the price for the same item. Or the procedure in the public health system costs X, in the private health system it costs Y. And some 20 years ago, the differential was actually very small. Today, the differential, and I'm not here to give an opinion on right, wrong or otherwise, but today the differential is becoming too large, and it's a capitalist system which interferes within a social need of health that's starting to drive some negative outcomes on affordability. And I can't say enough, it's not a push about private health insurance. It is that our 50-50 mix in Australia has driven our brilliant outcomes. If it drops to 20% of people having private health insurance and 80% having public, we will end up with different health outcomes. Again, and I've got a non-executive director sitting here, hoping Diane doesn't take notes, but I often say, look, from an actuarial and a finance point of view, I don't really care, we'll just insure the rich. Because actually, the rich will keep paying for private health insurance. If we trebled the premiums tomorrow at HBF, those with the money would still pay. And the outcomes, though, in society would be vastly different, because the public health system, and that's what you end up with in the US, right? So I'm really passionate about health innovation and what happens. But I think this point around health innovation for me is super excited about being involved in it. We as a company are getting involved heavily in health innovation and trying to support government and the community to drive better health outcomes. As I say, the irony when I sit in the room is you drive better health outcomes, which means people live longer, and the costs go through the roof. Health costs are rising by around 7%, and look at post-COVID, our wage growth will be 0. So people's wages go up by 0, at the equivalent, or any of the health funds put the premiums up by 4 or 5%, and clearly as a percentage of wages, it's becoming vastly more expensive. So the innovation in health for us is enormously exciting, but it's this conflict of interest in terms of the economics means that health innovation, and there's very few areas, and there will be some, but there's very few areas that I've studied where the actual innovation in health has led to overall reduction in costs. It leads to a reduction in cost in the item you're looking at. If it adds to longevity, it adds to the health costs. And of course, we're seeing those issues around aged care and those sorts of things. So I think then I go back to my sort of opening point around, I think the solution around health innovation and entrepreneurship and the next steps for us as a community is this point around who pays. And if we can sort out properly who pays and what people should pay, and then I think also this interesting point, and Glen, I know as an entrepreneur, and I'm someone who would love to be one, but when you look at the return on equities out of health insurance, and I'll make again the bold statement that in fact the government floated Medibank and allowed Bupa into the Australian market. Those two companies hold 40% market share of the private health insurance market. Most of the globals are making enormous double-digit return on equities out of the health sides of the market in terms of inventions and entrepreneurship. And it's making a really big difference to the Australian health outcomes. And finally, the point, so I think we celebrate a variety of different outcomes in the Australian health sector. We should be doing more around innovation, but often people don't mention that the Australian health segment is actually a very expensive sector. So when you compare it globally, we always talk about the health outcomes, they're brilliant. The actual unit cost on any prosthesis, the unit cost on hospital admissions, the unit cost on some of the things we deliver is actually on a global scale really, really high. And I'm quite concerned about that because I think if our innovation doesn't start to deliver a reduction in costs, just like every other country in the world, we have that unfundable outcome as a community. And I think the funding piece around who pays is one, and then what should we pay is number two, and then what are the levels of return. And we're seeing this capitalism versus socialism challenge around third world countries as well. We have a new medical invention, it's a fantastic outcome, but guess what? Most of those countries don't have access to it. Most of them will never get access to it. And again, it tends to be one thing we know is, here's another interesting stat for you at HBF. We know that those who take gold covers, who pay more for their health insurance, live longer. And you think, well, how can that be? Well, the answer is those who are far more interested in health and those who invest more in their health end up claiming more in their health, but they're actually the ones that live a lot longer. And we have a great deal of proof around that. Was when we have an HBF morning tea for all those members who have been with us over 50 years. And I stupidly sent out a letter to all those members. I've got 4,750 acceptances for a morning tea to hear from me, a cup of warm tea and a stale muffin. And what we learnt was we had several people over the age of 100 attend, many mid-90s, low 90s, all those sorts of things. And the common theme that we understood was that all those members that are genuinely invested in their health are the ones that live longer, and guess what? They're the ones that cost us the most. So I finish on the point that the economics bit is what excites me around health. But if we don't study those economics and the financial challenges and start to discuss what happens in some of the entrepreneurship and some of the inventions that are coming out and how much we should and shouldn't pay for them, we're going to have a pretty big problem down the track. And I wouldn't let my actuary loose on you, but please believe me, if I allowed the actuary to produce what the premiums look like in 22 years and what the outlook is, at least you'd go via suicide before the end, because he is so black-hatted on, do you realise these premiums will continue? And when you use the compound effect of circa 4 or 5% over a period of the next 20 years, and the actual economic outlook on wages will be well below that. The affordability in Australia in 20 years' time is going to be a significant issue. So I'll stop there and happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Peter, could I just, one thing I forgot to mention, which I really wanted to, was quantum computing and edge computing. The advances that have been made in medicine have been very much about the ability to calculate and visualize. And these advances have been phenomenal. But it's nothing like what we're going to see. And if we can get things like these amazing new technologies functioning, which I know they are actually operating quantum, there are quantum computers working right now, one in Roche, and they're able to do computations that have never been seen before, never possible. So these advances may have an impact on making John's life even worse. But on the other hand, imagine what would happen if we didn't have the internet during this lockdown. What would have happened to all the people? What would they have done? I mean, the internet has actually caused that vertical rise you saw in that graph. So, you know, it's sort of, how does the community, and there is an economic equation you can talk about, how do you actually allocate your resources across the country? And I think one of the things that COVID has taught us, the politicians are prepared to allocate almost any amount of money to save lives which are publicly demanded. We've never seen $500 billion spent so quickly before. And in the UK, it's £500 billion. And that was under some financial model that was created. Now, it may be right, it may be wrong, I'm not saying that, but these are monumental. They're really challenging all of the frameworks. I mean, for John, can you imagine that money has been spent that might have been available to, instead of have private funding, you had the government understanding responsibilities and the needs of the public, and they need better healthcare. That's what they're craving for. Not so much in Australia, I have to say, it's fantastic here, but nevertheless, these are the dilemmas that we've just walked into.
I would say there's one point that came out of COVID was telehealth. We've talked so many times about telehealth, and there was so much bureaucracy between health funds and government that we couldn't seem to get it going. Actually, when COVID hit and people said, I'm going to the doctors via the video and you'll have to pay, we actually did pay, and it started to work, and there's been some really unique learnings quite quickly. And again, as a non-clinician, but I know clinicians in the room will know that the most important way to reduce cost and have a quicker outcome is to get to the doctors quicker. And one of the things we learned about telehealth was they got to the doctor far quicker. They did a quick consultation and were probably on antibiotics or any other cure far quicker than they were. So the telehealth side was something that has been a really good outcome from COVID. It's moved quite quickly and starting to do well. Other than the chiropractic manipulations didn't go too good, even though we got charged for a few. Yeah, that's obvious. Yeah, I won't start on that, but we did get a few interesting telehealth claims.
Actually did one race. Okay, so let's throw it open to discussion, and I know there's some people on, if I look above me, there's some people on Zoom, so hopefully they can just jump in. And if I get a signal, someone can see someone's waving up there, I'll try and revert to them too. If you've got a question or comment, please just raise your hand. I'll try and pick you, and maybe just say, give your name at the start when you first speak. That'd be great, and maybe affiliation. So Samantha, I saw you quick on the mic there, so over to you.
I've got the mic, so I'm in control.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. My name's Jessica, and I am a mental health advocate. I'd like to ask John, given his attitude, if he maybe invented COVID to get rid of the elderly, to reduce the longevity.
I now know I shouldn't have said it, but it's too late, too late.
And maybe you invited your gold class members into the one room during lockdown when you thought they might maybe check COVID. But I'd also like to say mental health obviously needs a lot more backing financially as well as clinicians. And I think that we wouldn't be increasing people's longevity, but increasing their quality of life. So we're on the same page. So back mental health with some finances, and all will be well. We'll both be happy.
Yeah, look, one of the, it's that, so hips, knees and mental health are the three most increasing components of our underlying cost base. And mental health probably one of the most rapid at the moment. So it's interesting things like, to give a statistic, there's 350% growth in 20 years on hips and knees, and mental health claims are above that with justifiable reason. The most difficult thing we see as a company is which are the mental health interventions that we should support the most. We're just a payer. We do not enter into clinical interference, and we need the medical community to assist us in what's the best way. And that's one of the most difficult bits I find, again, as a non-clinician, as I listen to the debate. I have the MBS codes, or the federal government approve what should and shouldn't be paid for, and a public debate around what service works and doesn't work. So is it hospitalisation during mental health? Is it counselling? All those different things. And that's where I need the medical fraternity's help to give us clarity around what's the best services to pay for, what's the most effective, and where do we want to head with that.
Yeah, and research, as you say, into the most effective strategies. Like Glenn said, similar to his daughter, I'm also in eating disorders. Oh, I am his daughter. That's obviously had a massive increase in recent referrals, as has all of mental health, with a 2 to 3-fold increase in wait list that all clinicians are seeing across the board. But I agree with you. I think, mental health emergency departments need to be adopted, I think, actually, and to take away the strain on the hospital emergency departments who don't necessarily have the expertise to deal with the mental health that's coming in.
Look, we'd certainly like to do more, and a nice point to finish on for me is, as an example, mental health in Western Australia many years ago, HBF funded the first clinic, which is Perth Clinic, and that was opened in conjunction, and I wish I knew the original chair lady's name, but we funded that clinic to get it open. There was no private mental health clinic in Western Australia prior to our involvement all those years ago. So we'd like to do more, just need a bit more guidance on best direction.
Thank you.
I'm Diane Smith-Gander, and I'm the chair of the Business School Advisory Board and a non-executive director of HBF Health, but a very new one. But I'm really interested, Jessica, in what you were saying, because when John was talking, I was feeling monumentally depressed. Great health outcomes, we're making all these investments, but people are going to live longer, and it's all going to be horrible. And people living longer didn't seem so horrible to me. One of the other things I do is I chair Safe Work Australia, which is the policy-making body for work health and safety and workers' compensation. And the thing that's been absolutely fascinating over this COVID period is, I think everyone says that what COVID has done is whatever trend there was, it's just put it on steroids. So Glenn, we saw the uptick in online and so forth. And I think that what we're seeing is that the health and safety outcomes are really around mental health. So the large proportion of workers' compensation claims in the COVID world are for mental health damage, not for physical damage from COVID. And that really resonated with me, because one of my other directorships, Wesfarmers, where I've been on the board for 11 years, we used to own the Coles business, the supermarkets. And when you would look through the workers' compensation statistics, you would see, lots of small slips and trips and, things that had gone wrong given the nature of the work. But then there would be, at the far end, a really small number of humongous claims. And every single one of them was someone that had ripped their back, hurt their ankle, buggered up their hand through some sort of, it's a technical term by the way, through some sort of repetitive strain, and then hadn't been able to work and had been told to rest, and they'd rested for 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it was, and then there was a secondary mental health claim. So I think there is some dynamic here, John, that maybe actually we're going to be able to address those issues and get some benefit out of that, so that the system actually becomes more affordable by addressing these things way earlier in the chain. There's going to be a real issue for corporate Australia, because how do you know when to stick your nose into, or how to stick your nose into mental health? So unabashed plug for one of the Coles executives. So the head of Coles Work Health and Safety has spent the last 6 months writing a book on the topic. Practical guidance for managers on how to stick your nose into mental health. I'll send you the details.
Yeah, and preventative action. Exactly. What research has shown that if you get in with a good preventative program, you reduce mental health issues by 15 to 20% every month. Yeah, getting into school.
So Samantha, then Shamit.
Thank you very much. My name's Samantha. I wear a number of hats, but today I'm here with my UWA hat on. And by the way, just on the preventative mental health piece, we do have something significant at UWA looking at exactly that in the youth. So I'll pick that up with you after. But my question is this: when I listen to Glen, what you say, I ask myself, where can Western Australia best play in innovation in the health sector? Because we can't address everything. We can sit here and say we've got all these problems, and I hear the cost piece and I saw that list. But I sit in the resources sector, I sit in other things. We ask ourselves the same question: where are we in this state best placed to play? And I look at this university, and I know we've got the Dean of Medicine online as well. How could we direct the research that we do or the efforts that we make? Where's the best bang for buck?
So there are some very knowledgeable people on this planet that specialise in understanding where the needs are. Most of them are clinicians, and they're not asked. But you get a lot of McKinsey do fantastic reports on this. But I had the same position as a family. We were deciding, well, we wanted to do something meaningful. We were fortunate to have some money. We wanted to get out there and make a difference. So we looked at obesity and said, we know, and this was back in 1995, we said, we know that obesity is going to become one of the biggest problems in the world. It was blindingly obvious. In 2005, I had a meeting at the House of Lords with the head of Coca-Cola in Europe, the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, the leading crisp manufacturer, craft food, they're around the table. And they all asked me, because I was in diabetes, they said, well, what do we do about diabetes? And I said, you've got to deal with these people. It's at the front end. It's the same with the mental health thing. Front end. I could make some money out of this if everybody gets ill, but it's a little bit the opposite of what you're saying. It's fantastic. So I think it's not that difficult. If you see that you've got certain skills in your science network or your medical network, it's not that difficult as long as it's guided. And I think you need an international input into that. You can talk to people from Goldman Sachs. They have great analysts. I've got a list here of one of the, in fact, can we get my PowerPoint? I'll just show you I picked up a PowerPoint, a couple of points on what are the capital markets saying? Are the technologies of the future? If you wanted to get into that kind of thing. But it was quite interesting. Smart inhalers, robotic surgery, wireless brain sensors, 3D printing, artificial organs, health wearables, precision medicine, virtual reality, telehealth, CRISPR. Now, I'd add to that CAR T therapies, which are immunology. So I can, in the health space, and other things. There's another one. Let's go. Yeah, and so this was the one that came out of the US capital markets just the other day. Gene therapy, gene editing still is big. So, if you want to get into that, you have to actually search the world for the guy that's sitting in some lab somewhere who's made the, and they're there. And some of them are unhappy. When I was at Harvard, I used to listen to people saying, I have no potential to make any economic gain out of anything I do at this university. So I'm going to MIT. So, you know, you know that. You meet people who are trying to do things and that for whatever reason, they're not particularly happy with their lot. So I know you can't do everything, but you know, immunotherapy, CAR T therapy, stem cell therapy, tissue engineering, 3D printing, and senolytic rejuvenation medicine. I mean, in America right now, there's so much money going into making our lives longer, unfortunately, John. I mean, it is humongous.
I can definitely see my speech landed the wrong way. My next bit of the model is how we fund it, but I didn't get it. Yeah.
And you know how you fund it is have a positive GDP growth. And you know, in it, I've seen the UK suffering for so long because their community is just becoming poorer and poorer, and the economic growth isn't there anymore. They've lost their advantages, they've lost their verve. And that's what I was thinking about. Well, what would I do here in Western Australia to get that verve back? And you've got it because you've got the resources. If China and Australia has a big problem, you won't be talking about expansionary thoughts. It'll be a different thought completely, because the resources income that's generated for this country is 43% of the gross revenues. You don't want to have that hampered in any way, and then you won't have any money to spend on this. And that's the trouble in the UK. They're saying, well, we've got a certain amount we can spend. We don't want to borrow because we've just blown our budgets with $500 billion spending on COVID. So how are we going to make healthcare work in our country when the drain on it with the NHS, you know how much that was suffering. So, and my son came out here because they can't pay their doctors properly. Did all the training there and comes straight out here 3 years after he finishes training. Works 90 hours a week. You know, so Australia is in the most amazing position. You know, and it just needs focus, I think. Let's go with vision to start with, but focus secondly. This sustainability report is the vision, actually. There's a lot in here that talks about, you know, improve mental health outcomes and commit and collaborate to address major. It's very good, but it has to fit within your comparative advantage, which is, I think, is what you were asking. You know, that's how do you determine for us? And we as a family said, we can do drug delivery systems. We can't develop a new biotechnology drug because we don't have the funds to do that. But we can look at how can you deliver that drug more effectively. And that's why we went for oral insulin. And then in the immunological space, it was drug delivery. How do you deliver some of these bacteria or viruses or virus particles using lipids as opposed to RNA, DNA. And so, you know, there's a lot of smart people in Western Australia who will help with that.
Shamit Sagar, as Peter announced earlier, I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute. I think just on that last point, Glenn, you're undoubtedly right. I mean, Australia is going through a sort of golden age in which resources are so available for the purposes of industrial and commercial innovation. Healthcare just happens to be the thing we're talking about today, that it has no comparator right across, you know, the G7 or the G10. It seems to me now the question that leads to, of course, is there a danger of inherent complacency and not seizing that moment? We could have a separate event on that, but let's not do that right now. Can I just go back to something that John said in passing? And I think it's kind of important in sort of picking up this point about the well-off, the rich living longer, your morning tea story. It's to do with causality, because it could simply be that those who are paying more for their healthcare are living longer, not because they're paying more, but because of all the things that have happened in their lives prior to them having to deal with certain ailments. In other words, it's simply to do with socioeconomic status. If I'm born into a family that's a have rather than a have not, good things start happening to me at a very early age. At a very, very early age indeed, and that sort of accumulates and compounds over many, many years. By the time I'm well off enough to sort of be paying high premiums, notwithstanding what you're actually saying about 20 years from now, the die is already cast. So there's a real important point about causality here, that actually you're dealing with sort of insurance, which is trying to price interventions for people who become unwell, but actually it's not really to do with the underlying level of well-being that they're experiencing in any case. That's to do with something else out there in society. Very quick question I want to ask you, which is that could you sort of map out what you think would be the sort of the big hit sort of health ailments and potential treatments we might be discussing in 20 years from now if we regathered? I mean, there's so much innovation over here. What might be the things we'd be picking up?
I think the first one, just in right of reply, one of the statements you made, I absolutely agree with you. And the point I was attempting to make was, in Australia, we've actually had a really broad middle class. We've got a high GDP, and to have 50%, as an example, in the UK, it's around 20% of people have private health insurance. 80% of people rely on the NHS with a large population, and that's getting worse. So my point around, we've had this broad middle class. Most people, my mum and dad, migrant son, didn't have the money. They could afford HBF because in those days it was cheap. It's still, on a world scale, very inexpensive. What I'm explaining is the trend is getting so bad that we won't end up with 50% of Australians with private health cover. We'll go to the UK, US model, which will be 20%, and you're right. So the haves in Australia have always been 50%, and the have-nots have been 50, if I put it that way. We're heading towards the haves will be 20% and the have-nots will be 80, and that will then lead to those other health outcomes. Another really passionate point around Australia is who pays, but we need to improve the model, is the superannuation system put in Australia is, again, world leading. It's fantastic. And our GDP out of resources is fantastic. But currently Australians retire and you buy a ute and a jet ski and a caravan and you head away, and the government pays for your health. And we need to start to structure. The people under the age of 35 in Australia have a massive amount of superannuation compared to the rest of the world. We need to start to allocate some of that to aged care and health, because it's not just the government should pay. And then on the next point around the health innovations, for me, I'm not really qualified to say. I can give you the stats on the trends we see, that the level of innovation around prosthesis in particular, rather than life-saving items, are, for instance, and there's clinicians in the room who can explain this, do 350% more people really need a plastic hip and plastic knee, or is it the health professionals are starting to force the economics that way too much? And one of the points, the interesting thing, and I discussed with a lot of people who lived in London for 9 years, would be we have a great health system, but actually you watch at times with the NHS, we're probably slightly more conservative around the approaches to medicine and what they will and won't pay for. In Australia at the moment, if you need, like, we do more, there's clinicians in the room, but here's my stat, but we do apparently one of the highest number of colonoscopies in the world, bar none. And someone gave one to my dad the other day at 81 and nearly killed him, and someone goes, well, why do you have one anyway? And there's a lot of, around our health, we have a lot of quite aggressive medical intervention because we've got such high GDP and because we've got such high payers. So I think the next thing I see about the level of innovation is making sure that you use innovation and health outcomes in the right manner, rather than it lead more towards a really affluent part of, society and medicine. And I think we do have some challenges. Again, the point I was trying to make was this is a brilliant medical outcome in Australia. It's not a low cost one. And if you look at cost versus benefit in Australia, to be really, I'm never going to get another invite with medical practitioners in, but anyway, but our cost cost versus benefit in Australia, we actually are quite high cost, and there is other countries that still deliver good outcomes at a lot lower cost. Our prosthetics in Australia are one of the highest in the world. There's no real reason for that other than we just pay for it and accept it.
I've got a quick question. My name's Liz Dallymore. I know a lot of you in the room. So, and Glenn, this one is for you. So it's really looking at, you know, there's I guess a lot of optimism around WA and what we're trying to achieve within Western Australia, but we are still very poor at commercialising, obviously, innovative technologies that are homegrown in WA, and there's a whole raft of reasons for that. But what we are exceptionally good at is commercialising mining technologies. So we are world leading in that. We are #1 globally for commercialising mining technologies. And I always have a feeling that it's because developing as a startup or a small company with mining technologies, you can walk across the road and you can talk to a Rio, you can talk to a Chevron, you can talk to those people that ultimately are going to buy those technologies. So, you know, as a biotech or a med tech small company or spinning out of universities, to actually then commercialise it yourself is very difficult to do, and you probably will never do it. You need someone to come in and buy that technology. We don't have that here. It is extremely hard to get large pharma, large device companies to WA. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that. How do we bridge that tyranny of distance within WA to actually sort of push those technologies out to those people that will ultimately commercialise them?
So that was the reason why I ended up in the UK for 30 years. I started a company here that invested in a point-of-care diagnostic, the first ever point-of-care diagnostic in bacteria, which was Helicobacter, and also the first ever oral vaccine, which was a development by Professor Clancy in Newcastle. We took both of those to market, but I couldn't raise the money here. We were lucky to be able to do the analytics, though, to be able to understand that both those projects had a high probability of success, and we were perhaps a bit lucky. So I'd say that how it's changed is that I still see a lack of organised capital, and a couple of my bottlenecks are local risk capital for life sciences, you know, allocated with an international view. So I think what could have changed it now, though, is Zoom. You know, forget the name of the company, you know, whether you use Skype or whatever, but more people are aware that you can, I can log into New York. I'm not afraid to log into somebody who's got the knowledge, and I could be in here. I'm prepared to do it 12 hours difference. I know it's difficult. So I think as long as we have the networks, which is the last big point I wanted to make to you, my life is about networks. I could not have gained the knowledge I have without networks. And as long as you've got networks, be it alumni or be it university collaborations, be it whoever you worked with, you know, we're just networks. They can open the door on so many things. So I was able to go to the leading universities in America and Europe anytime I wanted to because I was a member of this YPO network. And I started a biotech YPO group, roundtable we called it, strangely enough. And I did 13 visits over 5 years, and I just chose Cold Harbor. I was in San Francisco, I'd go to New York, I'd go to Paris. It was wonderful. And I could get people giving me input. And I remember the Harvard guy telling me about his combination with the engineering faculty, which is another important point. Science and engineering merging like at Mayo Clinic with the University of Arizona, really important move. But anyway, how he was creating this organ, you know, a liver, and it was on a scaffold, and it was the engineering challenge that was giving him the problem. He knew he had to do stem cell work. So I think we can, with the, you know, you've lived internationally. It's not a fear factor. It's not you're not blind to it anymore. No one's blind to it in this room, and so I think it's out there for us. I mean, Fiona, I remember when I first met you, as you know, the energy that Fiona brought. I mean, that's what we've got to lock into up there, you know. And I think it's available through networks. So can this university be a sort of bellwether for the network, for attaching us to other universities? Like one of my suggestions was that UWA should be being taught, the children here or the young adults here be taught by MIT, Cambridge, perhaps Stanford lecturers. I mean, it's possible now. And that opens your whole ability to see the world in a different way, because you know that you're not going to be blindsided by someone who doesn't know the latest technology.
Right, I could jump in there as a capital markets type person. I think our success, especially in Western Australia, leads to the failure of innovation in other areas. So when you're walking into capital markets, you're far better off. In fact, if Fiona had have put lithium on the end of that clinical cell company, it probably would have raced ahead further. And you speak to you go into the capital markets people in here, because our mining is so successful. You're trying to innovate in terms of, I helped listed a anti-money laundering technology company here, which I'm still on the board of, and Australians aren't interested in it in terms of tech and money laundering, and it's what is that? And biomeds, what is that? And if you walk in to a capital markets room and go, look, it's got a bit of lithium in it, it's like, bang, how much do you need? And so we are and therefore people have made so much money, especially in this town, via minerals and resources. They're blinded. And I know I've worked on a few committees with Peter. As one of the points is every time I sit in the room in Western Australia in particular, mining takes over everything, and it's very difficult to get oxygen. And unless universities like Western Australia and others have some successes, the best thing we can do is use things like Fiona Wood's success and those sorts of things to drive the innovation into other areas, because honestly...
And I think that's the time frame as well, unless you've got that liquidity for an IPO or something like that.
Well, we're a small population. You actually do need mum and dad investors, being a capital markets person, and they've got X amount to allocate, and every next door neighbour will tell them to put it into the mining stock, not into the biomed, not into this.
The question about for exactly that reason. And it might be that to leverage the most success, you attach some health innovation to resources. There is an overlap there.
But when first...
I'm thinking of that lithium health idea. I'm trying to
swallow
it'll raise a lot of capital. Yeah.
But when the health thing started, the biotech thing started in California, in San Diego, some parts there with Genentech and Amgen, they had failures early on. They then had a couple of successes, and the successes in biotech are so phenomenal. It was like Vesuvius, and the money that spilt out over the top, guess what? Got reinvested back by the local community. So they then created this huge network of investors. And that's what happened here. I don't know if you remember the Poseidon era. Some of us might remember the Poseidon era. And the money that spilled out of that one success, because it went up by 100-fold. And people, everybody in the street was talking about it. So whilst I accept what John's saying, that's what I put up with, I can't believe 30 years later we can't change that.
We've got to change it.
Can I just... Peter Clinton, Chief Scientist at WA. Thank you, Glenn and John, for what were terrific presentations, and I loved your honesty. I think that's just crucial for us to have a mature debate and discussion around these issues. I'm just wondering if I can give a couple of vignettes before I ask my question. The first one, Glenn, was around talent and facilities. There's a wonderful example in Western Australia now where we recruited senior individuals from Imperial College London to the Australian Phenome Centre, set them up with world-class facilities. They've done some stunning work in COVID now, and Cambridge University and Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge are sending thousands of samples to WA to do the analyses rather than having done in the UK. Okay, so that I think just goes to the point of talent, expertise, facilities, right? A wonderful example of that. The second one is around your question, Samantha. What could we focus on? And if you're looking at a comparative advantage, Western Australia is a biodiversity hotspot. We're one of 14 biodiversity hotspots on the planet. We have bugs, slugs, plants, everything that don't exist anywhere else in the world. There is a screaming need for antibiotics, antivirals, anti-cancer agents. And the pharmaceutical industry walked away from natural product screening because they found it too hard. They felt their chemists could make molecules a lot faster and could get through the high throughput screening faster. That's actually a model that has not worked. We need to go back to saying Mother Nature has got a whole lot of 3D molecules that no chemists can actually synthesize and use our comparative advantage here, turn that into a massive competitive advantage, in my view.
You think, since I've known that one of the very first things I heard you talk about, what do you think is the barrier for us?
Vision. Having that vision, and then having, at the moment, all the steps are in place for that, but they're all little individual cottage industries. We do not have a clear pipeline of going from collecting plant to putting a pill in a bottle. And we don't actually have to go all the way. We can get to a point where big pharma become interested. You know, when we talk to AstraZeneca around that, for example, were you there, Michael? No, sorry. They said, we're not interested in soups. Don't give us a soup. Give us a clear broth. We might be interested, or give us a single entity. And we can do that. We can go all the way from plant to that single entity here in WA. And then you can go into attracting big pharma. Let's go back 50 or 60 years. There was no resource industry really to speak of in Western Australia. It was a vision in the 1960s which transformed this state into the resource sector that it is now. Well, what are the industries that we're going to have in the next 50 or 60 years? You know, there needs to be a clear vision, in my view, around that. Sorry, I sound like I'm preaching, but I am. My question is, the Sustainable Health Review, Glen, which you talked about, I think is a terrific document. The question is for John. Have you done the mathematical modelling around the costs associated with keeping people healthy?
Yeah, and again, you attend these things to probably at times be a bit controversial, of course. Ultimately, the other point around health is if you can spread the cost of health interventions over a lot longer period, then you can actually save cost, which we need to focus on. Unfortunately, and many others may have better data, but no one has cured the point we all die. And the statistics are that the longer you live, which is a fantastic outcome, but the longer you live, the more ailments you attract. So any of the, as an example, we're talking about vaccines for COVID, or let's go to something like AIDS. There's no cure, but people are now living with AIDS almost as long as any other person. So it's a fantastic outcome. The cost of that solution is massive. So everything I see, and it's not a negative comment, it's a positive comment for humanity. I try and purposely be forceful around who pays, because if we don't work out who pays and we don't sort of take some of the margin out of the products and everything else we're delivering for humanity, we simply won't afford it. And therefore my black-hatted bit is, well, therefore only those who can afford it will have access. And I go back to that point that I think we're on the next innovations for humanity will see us living a lot longer, which is fantastic. But no one that I've seen has solved the mathematical model of how you pay for it. And every time I look at it and stare at it, it gets worse, not better.
Can I just, Peter, can I just comment on the gomouche? I remember going to the FDA and presenting a product which had, was a biological product, but it was made from a plant. And that's exactly what they said to us. They said, we are not dealing with this. You have to get into that and tell us every single molecular structure in that, because it's the safety of our population that we've got to look after. And that's why I said the regulators, one of my key points was, and this is for an analysis of what projects you pursue in this industry, in the life sciences, is the regulatory impact. And I find that lacking in the Cambridge course that was done for Institute, the biotech course they're doing there. I went up there and I had a talk like this, and I could not believe what they didn't know. And they were going to be the young guns going out there deciding what life science projects we're going after. And if you get into something that means it's $1 billion of spend, it's not going to happen. So only the big players can do that. So you have to understand that. And I think, Peter, you addressed it by saying you were going to go down to a single molecule, because that's what the FDA require. But is that the absolute necessary endpoint? And if Australia could be a leader in allowing us to find out that maybe something a little less simple than that was actually healthy and it was safe and not toxic, maybe you don't have to have $1 billion cost to get to that point, or 20 years of arguing with people. You actually might get the answer a bit quicker.
So
I was just, hi, it's Fiona Wood here. I just add to that, about 20 odd years ago, I was growing skin cells in the laboratory of Marie Stoner, and we were decanting the fluid from the skin cells and putting them on the wounds of the same patient with chronic wounds, really very complex chronic wounds, and they were healing against the odds. And the TGA, we got a grant, a commercialization grant, and we had to give it back because the TGA said unless we could characterize every aspect of it, then we wouldn't be able to commercialize it. And so we had to give it away and let it just fade into the distance. And and I've just often thought back to that a particular woman that had bone exposed on her heel, a diabetic and the wrong side of 70 and refusing amputation. And we healed her for Tony House, was the professor at the time in surgery. And because he'd run me up and said, can't this growing skin sort something out? Jeez, that's a bit of a tall order. And it set off us on but it worked, and she died 9 months later, but with 2 legs. So it was, it solved the problem, and it opened this big research area that we just had to close down and walk away from. So that was 20 years ago. And so it sounds like things haven't really changed much. And I think you're right. We have to be courageous about tackling these problems, tackling the regulatory framework that surrounds us. Because if we're totally risk averse, what we'll do is nothing. And I think that's a real barrier. And I think I see that as increasingly a barrier to our innovation. But what I was going to ask really is this value-based healthcare. It's all about what we're doing, the right thing for the right person at the right time. It's all making sure it's valuable, yeah? And I think one of the innovations around that whole space for me is putting the patient at the center. Because many of those people, as you've alluded to, John, may not need or want, in fact, their head and neck cancer removed in a surgery that may actually kill them. And they may actually not want to go to hospital, but because they turn up to hospital, because there's no telehealth, and they get through the front door, we just do what we do best, and what we do best is do it, because that's what we are programmed to do. And so they get the x-ray, they find the cancer, they treat the cancer, and before you know it, you're down a rabbit hole of 3 months of pain and suffering, and somebody says, well, what would you like to do? Oh, well, you know best, doctor. No. I think the real innovation for me is actually not living longer, but living better. And I think you said we need better healthcare. We need a healthier community that has the choice, and that we facilitate the choice, and we are a pair of hands that will support and brain that will support them in their time of need. But we will listen to what their needs are. And that's an emerging piece in our community, and I think that's what we saw around COVID. I was involved in looking at the ideas from the I Think platform. Significant number of those were about patient personal choice. Staying safe, making the choice of themselves for their families, people around. So I think we've got to really turn that whole piece around. And the Sustainable Health Review costing, I am not a sort of economist, but I can tell you that is a runaway train unless people, every single one of us, takes responsibility, personal responsibility for the decisions we make. And I'm preaching as well, Peter, so I'll keep going. Because my life changed in 2005, and I was given an opportunity to have my voice heard, and I was asked a number of questions. And one was, what am I going to share with Australia? And I've seen basic science changed at the bedside. And by the way, in UWA, we have a 3D point-of-care robotic printer that's printing skin. Yes, only on pigs at the moment, but we're working on it. Anyway, and so we had I had seen the basic science to the bedside. And so how is this going to, how can we share this passion? How can we get everybody to understand that is in everybody's hands? And so the message I tried to share that year was that one of personal responsibility for the decisions you make about your health, your wellness, and your education. I'm not used to failing. I'm a particularly driven individual that's used to getting wins on the board. And I'd have to say, 15 years later, the message is still take personal responsibility for your health, your wellness, and your education. And it's been pretty stony ground up until recently. And I see that we've got an opportunity now. Some of those things coming from the community on the I Think platform about recovery, where it's the time is right for the community to engage in preventative medicine. The time is right to have those messages. Push the messages beyond smoking cessation into obesity, let's take it to Coca-Cola actually.
Yeah.
And let's take it and say, well, no, we're not gonna play this game anymore. And if you want to double your prices, fine, we'll play and we'll take that rest and we'll put it into paying for health. Because who should pay? Well, the people who cause the problem. Maybe that's where we need to go. And so I think that's a very long sort of brain dump. But what I'd like to see is a healthy community that takes responsibility for its health to such a point that it can help the vulnerable. Whether we're talking about resilience training, mental health first aid, burn first aid, I could teach you that in a minute, okay. Or anything you like, prevention is better than cure. And then we need to give the choice, and we need to use technology to give the choice. That's why telehealth is so important, to the people who are the receivers of our innovation. And ask them, what is it we should do? Yeah. So, sorry, I'll shut up now.
John, I just looked up, because very good. I think there's a couple of separate issues going on here. One is that whole preventative space and innovation around the patient. It's really worth Googling the Minerals Council of Australia and the downstream possibilities of our resources. So if you were looking at just pure commercialisation in the health space from what we already do, gold is plastic one. And there are downstream things that we can do in the healthcare sector that the capital markets would recognise.
Yeah. Just a quick comment on the regulatory point you made. COVID, one of the things on the screen was that COVID showed us that it was possible to make sensible regulatory decisions and completely change the development pathway for a vaccine and for a diagnostic. And they skipped things, and you could say it was dangerous or whatever. They've got the toxicity in mind when they're giving these approvals. So we're going to see something done. It really is. It's going to be done in perhaps a year to a year and a half. That would have taken 10 years before, actually would never have been developed. So, and they could only have done that with the exemption. So now that we've shown that it's possible, why don't we apply common sense to a lot of these situations, like the one you described? And that goes on everywhere. There's so many of those. And it's very frustrating if I'm outside the system to some extent and I see these decisions. And often it's given from a top level down to bureaucracy. And there's no one prepared to take that on. I don't, it's very difficult to say, let's be less safe. Because that's how people interpret it.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Glen and John, for the presentations. And it's an excellent discussion. My name is John Barrington. We have a medical technology startup here at UWA. It's called Artria, using artificial intelligence to detect and diagnose heart disease. Couple of opening points, and then to go on from there. We've raised $4 million angel and seed round from Perth-based investors. I think that's an important point. There is money in Western Australia, and there's money in Australia. We're actually going to a Series A in December. Goodness knows what the world will look like by then. But if we could keep the capital coming out of WA and stay in Perth, that's an important thing for the state.
Right, yeah.
We've just received a $1 million federal grant from the federal government. There's a $20 billion grant fund there, just one fund. There is a lot of money around. You just need to know how to access it. And the reason I go through those 2 points is it's interesting at this health forum, we've got a VC person and the capital markets person, but it does come to commercialisation. And going back to that grant that we've been successful in and where the grant funding is going in Australia, which is a good thing, is to commercialisation. Because all the research in the world, if the development doesn't lead to a commercial outcome, a sustainable commercial outcome and a health outcome, then it's not going to hit the streets. So with that, and talking about strategy, I absolutely agree with the point. Strategy is about focus. And it was actually the chief scientist who defined the 5 areas this state should focus on. And it's as much about what we're not going to do as what we are going to do. And medical research is one of them. And so then when we focus in medical research, I think we've got to play to our strengths. And what are we good in here? And how do we actually, and it might be, it's just by chance we've become good in an area, but play to those strengths and talk them up. And I don't think Australians or West Australians are very good at talking things up. And again, strategy is about storytelling. We've got to tell the great stories, the author cells, the onco-reses. You know, what Fiona's work is, we've got to really focus on those. One area of strength that we have in Western Australia is the data linkage branch. This is a world-class longitudinal health study, and we would like to access it because we want to develop predictive technologies to stop adverse health events occurring. But no, we can't because we're a commercial entity. Now, that may change in the next 20 years. Too late. It's got to change with the velocity that we saw on your first chart. And I use that commercialisation point to say, we've got to speak to the bureaucrats and say, yes, it is a state-based asset and the taxpayers own it and you bureaucrats run it. We understand all that. Too bad. Talk to the hand, because this is about getting an outcome for people, for humanity. And this great asset is here. We should be able to access it and use it because it's going to have a great outcome. And so I think more and more people, and we're talking to the preaching to the converted here, but more and more people talking about those regulatory blockages or getting involved in areas that really aren't state strengths is what we've got to stop and really get the focus on where we can get the biggest advantage most quickly.
Could I just come in on the commercialisation? So I was charged by Lynn Beasley, who was the Agent General in London, to try to build a bridge between UWA and certain London universities for biotechnology and healthcare medtech developments. This was probably 9 years ago. And so I came down here and brought a couple of projects in and they were worked on, and there was no money. That was the problem. There just wasn't the structure. And I do know that there's the $3 to $4 million thing, but that's changed, as you said. You know, there are pockets of money around that I'm very pleased to hear that exist in Australia, firstly, and now they're starting to emerge here, but they have to be applied in the right approach. Commercialization, it's so difficult to get the distribution capability. And that's when you start to get drawn out of Australia. But I still think your point is right, that if you can capture as much of the economic value before you get to that distribution point, then the money will flow back in. You might spend it on a nice house and then somebody gets a job and whatever happens. So I'm 100% on that track. And I think now that the world's shrunk, it must be possible, Perth, with the right funding and the right smarts. Talking about the breadth of things that could be done and narrowness of things that could be done, I don't like that thinking. I'm not interested in what chaotically emerged from UWA and suddenly became you. I'm more interested in what was processed. We actually had a strategy. You went, maybe Peter's done this, so I don't know. But you go after areas that are of significance to the whole country or to the Western Australia or to the world, whatever it is. But because I think West Australians and Australians have an amazing capability of focusing and converting. I see a lot of stuff wobbling around in England with people that don't have the focus that obviously you've got, the clarity. It's not my job. I'm not good enough. There's all this stuff. Here, you have to get on with it. You don't have the resources. You have to be multifaceted. And I think bringing some stuff in here might help get things done that otherwise couldn't be done. So I'd try and stay open. I do agree, find the ones that are great that you've got, but when I looked, there weren't many things that were great in the life sciences area. Now, I didn't see everything, But I can just tell you that if you go to Oxford, you can see a hell of a lot of stuff that is right at the front end of the world. And we're competing with that, you know, like, so I do get the 2 points, but I think you could bring some of that stuff down, as Peter said, got the people from Imperial. Fantastic.
Okay, look, we're all going to live longer, but time is still scarce. So perhaps I did promise the final word to the Public Policy Institute. Maybe just a quick summary. I think regulation's been pretty soon. If you want to make a comment, and then I'd like to invite you all back for well, one standard drink, depending on your value, your health, maybe two, back in the foyer of the business school straight after the Thank you, Shane.
Peter, thank you. I won't stand between you and that drink. Just two very quick points. In inviting Glen to talk a little bit about the innovation ecosystem of Western Australia specifically, and Australia more largely, on health innovation, I think you've clearly triggered a wider discussion. It's quite apparent to me that there's a train of thought that going in 5 or 6 different directions, some to do with the social aspects of healthcare, others to do with the decisions of investors and capital markets. It's a very rich theme that we've sort of touched upon. So first of all, I'm delighted that the Public Policy Institute has co-sponsored and co-hosted this. It's a great privilege for us. But can I just also make the other point, which is that in the end, probably the best answer to Glen's question that he's posing has to do with the courage, the leadership, the vision that I think Peter was alluding to and others in doing so, which is how do you get a society and an economy and a political system that is doing so very, very well by doing what it does to do something differently? In other words, can there be a negative drive and not just a positive carrot in another direction? And that is a bit like asking, you know, who will be our friends, who will be our trading partners in the future? Because, you know, the mining and resource industry is very, very lucrative indeed. It creates good things, but it has unintended consequences in terms of shutting down conversations and opportunities. Absolutely, we should reconvene at another stage to have that conversation, but not now. Let's stop now and have that drink. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamit. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Please join us for drinks. I'll just finally quickly say thank you to the organisers, and thank you also to David McInlay, who's been a driver of this event. So I'll see you all in the foyer. Just follow me or just work your way around the front of the building. Thank you very much.